Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Now during this quarantine time, I've found myself making a lot of traditional and comforting recipes at home. So this past week, I made a batch of goja. Now for anybody who doesn't know what goja is, it's basically a coconut pastry of sorts, and the coconut is flavored with some warming spices, some sugar, and it is colored red. Now you have two options when making this dish. You can stuff it into a flaky pastry crust, and you can bake it like I'm going to do today. Or you can go ahead and stuff it into a dough that's more so like fried bake, and you can fry them. Now, if you want the fried version, go ahead and check it out on my channel. I posted it about a year or two ago, and I'll link it right up here on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, if you want this version today, the baked version, then you're going to want to keep on watching this video. So to make my pastry crust today, I'm going to go ahead and use my food processor. I just find that it's much easier to use the food processor than my hands. So in the food processor, I'm starting off with my all-purpose flour. I went in with a little bit of salt, and I went in with some unsalted butter. Now, if you're using salted butter, then you're going to want to omit the salt. Now, as you guys can see, I probably overstuffed the blender a little bit. So I'm actually going to take out half of it and do this in batches just to get the butter mixed in. And once you get your butter all mixed in, you're going to go ahead and add in your shortening, and you're going to go ahead and keep on pulsing it until you get a fine crumb texture. You want them to be almost like breadcrumbs, just so you get little lumps of the shortening and the butter within the flour. Now again, my blender or my food processor is a little small, so I'm doing this in 2 batches just to get it all worked in. But if you have a large food processor, go ahead and do it in 1 large batch. And as usual, if you want all of the proper ingredients and the measurements, they will be in the description box below this video. All you have to do is click on the little box below the video and it'll drop down and you'll see everything down below. Now, I also have a video on my channel where I go step by step on how to make a pastry crust. And that's the exact same recipe I'm using here. I'll have it linked right up here in the right hand corner too, just in case you want to see that. But basically, this is exactly what you want the flour, the shortening, and the butter to look like after you're done pulsing it in the food processor. You want to make sure that it's nice and fine and crumbly because that's what's going to give you those flaky layers when you go to stick it in the oven. Now, I think this is one of the biggest questions that I always get in any recipe that I use shortening in. Everybody always asks if they don't have shortening, what could they use? Now, the easy and the simplest answer is go ahead and just use all butter. It will not make too much of a difference. You'll still have a perfect flaky pastry crust. Now, I just like to use shortening because it's what I have on hand, it's what I was taught, and I like the texture better. But if all you have is butter, go ahead and use that. So as I said before, I went ahead and I did 2 batches of the butter, the shortening, and the flour in my food processor to get everything mixed together into a nice little crumbly dough. Now basically what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start streaming in some ice cold water. Now the way that I like to do this is I like to get a little cup and I like to add in some ice cubes and then pour some water on top. So this way the water's nice and icy cold. And what you want to do is stream it in just a little bit at a time until you get a nice semi-soft dough. You just want it to come together, and once you see that it can form a ball by itself, then you can go ahead and stop adding water. Now, all of you guys always ask me how much water I use in my recipes for like doughs, but I cannot give you a measurement for that because every type of flour is different and it will absorb different amounts of liquids. So you just have to gauge it for yourself and go ahead and test it out. This dough is actually very forgiving, so if it comes out a little too hard or a little too soft, you will get a nice end product regardless. Now when making a pastry crust, you have to use all cold ingredients, so cold butter, cold shortening, as well as the ice cold water, and you want to make sure not to touch it up too much with your hands because your hands add warmth to the dough and that's going to make it not get flaky in the oven. So that's why I'm using a fork, and I promise this will be a very flaky pastry. So once you mix in enough water and you see that the dough can smush together, you're going to go ahead and pour it out onto a piece of plastic wrap. And basically you're going to wrap it up and you're going to smush it together into a flat disc. And as you guys can see, when I poured it out, it was a little crumbly onto the plastic wrap. That's exactly what you want, because if it's too wet, it's going to be very hard to work with later. So I split it up into 2 pieces of plastic wrap, and I'm going to put the 2 discs into the fridge, and I'm going to leave it there for 30 minutes while I make my coconut filling. Now once you stick your dough in the fridge, you're going to go ahead and start working on the coconut filling. So this filling is very similar to that of red bread or Solara. It's basically coconuts, some spices, and sugar. So in my pot here, I've gone in with some freshly grated coconut, and if you don't have the fresh grated coconut, you can go ahead and use the already shredded coconut that's been sweetened. And if you have desiccated coconut, which is like the dry one, you're just going to want to reconstitute it with a little bit of hot water, and then you can use it just like this. And once you add the coconut into the pot or the pan, you're going to go ahead and stir it around on a medium to medium low heat for about 5 to 6 minutes, or just until you parch or toast the coconut just a little bit in the pan. I love parching my coconut not only because that's the way that I was taught to make these desserts, but also because it adds another layer of richness to that coconut flavor. And after a few minutes, you're going to go ahead and grate in your freshly grated nutmeg. Now, if you don't have freshly grated nutmeg, you can use the already powdered version of it. You just might have to use a little bit more because it's a little less pungent than if you grate it freshly. And after you add in that grated nutmeg, you're going to go in with some freshly grated ginger. Now again, if you don't have fresh ginger at home, then you can go ahead and use the powdered version. Again, you might have to use more of the powdered version because the fresh ginger is much more pungent than the powdered version. Now, I'm adding these spices about 3 minutes after I added the coconut into the pan. And basically what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stir this up and allow this to keep cooking for about 4 to 5 more minutes, basically until the coconut gets a little golden around the edges or until it cooks a little bit more. And while your coconut is parching or toasting in the pan with those spices and the flavorings, you're going to want to go ahead and keep on stirring it every so often, because if you stop stirring it, the coconut can burn very, very easily. And after about 7 minutes, I found that my coconut was parched enough for me. It had a little bit of golden brown flecks going on the inside, and I thought that that was perfect enough for me. But if you like the coconut to be a little darker when you're parching it, go ahead and cook it a little longer. Now, once you go ahead and see that it's done parching, you're going to go in with your sugar. I went in with a little bit of granulated sugar and a little bit of brown sugar. That's just because that's what I had on hand, but if you want to use one or the other, feel free to do so. Now, as soon as you add in that sugar, or right before you add in the sugar, it's important to turn off the stove, because if you don't turn off the stove, the sugar can melt and then it can start to over caramelize and it might even burn. Now, once you turn off the stove and you mix in the sugar, you're going to go in with a little pinch of salt to balance out the flavors, and then you're going to start sprinkling in your red food coloring. Now, a little word about red food coloring. I always prefer to use the powdered version because I find that sometimes the liquid version gives a slight taste that I don't like to the mix. But if the liquid version's all you have, just be mindful when you're adding it in and you can use it. And I know a lot of people say that they don't taste anything when they use the liquid version, but it's totally up to you. And once you add in the food coloring, you're going to go in with some vanilla extract. And if you don't have vanilla extract, you can use any type of essence or extracts that you have at home that you see would work in this dish. I know my grandmother used mixed essence in hers, and I know some people even use the almond essence in theirs. So it's totally up to you. And once you add in all of those ingredients, you're going to go ahead and mix it up really well. And then you're going to transfer this mixture out of the pot, or you can leave it in the pot depending on what you want. And you're going to let it cool down a little bit before we start to stuff them into the dough. And before I close out this screen, I wanted to let you know that the food coloring is optional. That's just a traditional way to make goja. But by all means, if you don't want any colorings in your food, go ahead and omit it. So I've been allowing my filling to cool for about 15 minutes at this point, and now I'm going to start working on the dough so we can fill these gojas and then bake them. So on my floured surface, I put on my dough, spread the flour around evenly, and I'm starting to roll it out really well. Now I like my pastry pretty thin, to about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch thick, but you can do it as the thickness that you like. I know some people like a thicker pastry, some people like it thinner. So I'm going to continue to roll it out until I get my desired thickness, and if you see that it starts to crumble or fall apart around the edges, it's totally fine. Just keep on bringing it back together and rolling it out. And once you go ahead and roll out the dough as per the thickness that you want, you're going to go ahead and cut out circles. Now my circles are about 4 inches in diameter, but you can make them smaller or bigger just depending on your own preferences. Now I'm using the top of like a bowl, but if you wanted to and you had a cookie cutter or a biscuit cutter or something like that, go ahead and use that. So filling the gojas is actually pretty simple. All you're going to do is put about 1 to 2 tablespoons of the filling into your dough that you already rolled out and cut. And then you're going to smush down the sides really well, because if you don't, the filling can actually leak in the oven and then it can burn, and that's not what you want. So once you press it down a little bit, you're going to go ahead and you're going to take a fork and then you're going to crimp down the edges. And you want to crimp it really well so this way, again, the filling doesn't leak out, because it just really becomes a mess when it leaks in the oven. And trust me, I know from experience. So just go ahead and be very cautious during this step. I also wanted to mention that while you're filling the gojas, do not overfill them. I know a lot of people say that, oh, the filling is the best part and you want to make sure to get as much of it in the dough as you can. And yes, that is very much true. I love the filling. but you want to make sure not to overfill it, because if you do, it will burst in the oven. Again, I do know from experience. So go ahead and just put about a tablespoon to 2 in the dough. Again, it depends on how big you made your circles, but don't overstuff them, please. And once you finish crimping the sides of the gojas, you're going to go ahead and take your fork that you're using and you're just going to prick it twice on the top. That's going to go ahead and create some ventilation for the filling on the inside, because what happens is if you don't put the holes on top, they can actually burst in the oven, and then again you have your filling spilling out in the oven and it actually burns on the pan, so you don't want that. And once you have all of your gojas stuffed and ready to bake, you're going to go ahead and put them on your baking sheet, and then you're going to go ahead and spread a little bit of milk on the top. Now, I know a lot of people always ask for eggless recipes, so I think this is the perfect eggless recipe because it has no egg in it at all. So I'm just putting the milk on because I'm making it eggless, but if you wanted to, you can go ahead and beat up an egg or an egg yolk, and you can go ahead and spread it on the top to give that nice golden brown color when it's done baking. Now, if you're worried about cleanup, you can go ahead and put some parchment paper down on your pan and then put the gojas on top of it. But I'm not using that today because I have a non-stick pan. But if you wanted to, by all means, use some parchment paper. And once you finish brushing the tops of the gojas with your milk or your egg, if you are using that, you're going to go ahead and sprinkle on a little bit of sugar. Now, I'm using granulated sugar on the top, but if you had some demerara sugar or some cane sugar, you can go ahead and sprinkle it on the top as well. And this part is 100% optional. You do not have to do that. Now, once you go ahead and get that sugar on top, or if you're not using it, once you get the milk or the egg on top, you're going to go ahead and bake it at 350 degrees for about 12 minutes to 15 minutes until they are nice and golden brown on the top. So I just pulled my gojas out of the oven, and as you guys can see, they have a beautiful golden brown color on the top, and I'm going to let them cool in the pan just for about a minute or two, and then I'm going to transfer them to a plate to serve. Now, I love me a warm goja fresh out of the oven, but you have to let it cool just a little bit, because if you don't, the sugar and the coconut in the oven, they created somewhat of like a syrup, and it's very wet on the inside. So if you cut into it too fast, you can actually have all of it leak out. So just go ahead and let them cool a little bit before you serve them. And as you guys can see when I broke it open, that pastry is super flaky. It has so many layers going on the inside, and that coconut filling is nice and juicy just the way you want it. So I will be eating a few of these with a cup of tea, and again, I just hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and give this video a nice big thumbs up, subscribe to my channel if you're not subscribed yet, and keep leaving your amazing comments down below. I hope all of you guys are staying safe, and again, if you don't have one or a couple of the ingredients to make this recipe, go ahead and use some alternatives like I mentioned in the video, or you can go ahead and leave a comment down below and ask me what other alternatives you can use.